Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Daniel Moak. I'm an assistant professor in the African American Studies Department here at Ohio University, and I want to welcome you all to the inaugural event of the Ted Rose Lecture Series in the African American Studies Department. We are thrilled today to have Dr. Derrick E. White with us for this event, and this event is co-sponsored by the Department of History, the Department of Political Science, the NAACP, the Black Student Organization Coalition, and the Multicultural Center. Dr. White is a professor of history and African American and Africana studies at the University of Kentucky. Through the lens of Black organizational life, he examines modern Black history, sports history, and intellectual history. He is the author of two books, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, J. Gaither, Florida A&M, and the History of Black College Football from the University of North Carolina Press, and The Challenge of Blackness, the Institute of the Black World and Political Activism in the 1970s from the University Press of Florida. He has also co-edited Winning While Losing, Civil Rights, the Conserva-tive Movement, and the Presidency from Nixon to Obama with the University Press of Florida, and he edited that with Kenneth Osgood. His recent book chronicles the development of Black college football in the 20th century and is among the first comprehensive histories of HBCU athletics. Using the biography of Alonzo J. Gaither and the history of the football program at Florida A&M University, he shows how Black college football and its supporters created successful programs during segregation by relying on a network of athletic enthusiasts in the media, on campuses, and in the community. This Black sporting congregation fueled the golden age of Black college football after World War II. In the 3 decades after World War II, Black college football programs and their coaches, led by Florida A&M and Gaither, were among the best in the entire country. Former Black college football players became stars in professional football, such as families Bob Hayes, who won 2 gold medals at the 1964 Summer Olympics, and he's also a member of the Pro Football Hall of Fame. His talk tonight is entitled College Sports, Social Justice, and Historical Memory. We are streaming this live on Facebook and YouTube, so if you do have questions throughout the talk, please do put them in the comments section, and we will try to get to them once the talk is concluded. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. White.
Thank you, Daniel, for the wonderful introduction. And let me also thank the participating and sponsoring organizations, the African American Studies Department, the History Department, as well as Political Science, the NAACP, the Black Student Organization Coalition, and the Multicultural Center. I also want to say a special thank you to Dr. Brian Jeffries. We started in graduate school together at The Ohio State University many, many years ago, and it is always an honor and pleasure to have known you all these years, as well as to let the Ohio University community know that you are a brilliant scholar and a committed chair, and they are honored and should be honored to have you at that institution. And I'm happy to have known you for as long as we have. So again, thank you guys for having me here at Ohio University as the inaugural Ted Rose lecturer. I'm gonna this evening do a few things. I'm gonna share my screen, so please, hopefully this will work very well. And so, as I said, the title of my talk this evening is College Sports, Social Justice, and Historical Memory. And before I begin too much further, I want to say start this talk by honoring Ted Rose's legacy at Ohio University. I did not know or get an opportunity to meet Dr. Rose, but my mentor and advisor and former chair of Black Studies at Ohio State, Professor William E. Nelson Jr., always asked us as graduate students, what does this have to do with the liberation of our people? This question permeates the work of Black Studies and exemplifies the dedication Dr. Rose gave Ohio University's African American Studies Department for more than 2 decades. A brilliant literary and film scholar, Dr. Rose, by all accounts, led the department with aplomb and grace. And this evening, it is a privilege to be a part of this lecture series named in his honor. In 2020, race, sports, and protests intersected in profound ways. Beginning in March, the sports world came to a screeching halt as the NCAA canceled its annual men's and women's basketball tournament, and professional sports leagues stopped their regular season games. With the United States and the world on lockdown in the spring, news of the latest examples of police brutality crisscrossed social media, capturing the attention of a world put on pause. In May, 3 tragic events of racial violence fueled a summer of protest. That month, the world was horrified as footage circulated of 2 white men murdering Ahmaud Arbery, a 25-year-old unarmed black jogger in Georgia. 2 weeks later, the FBI opened an investigation into Breonna Taylor's murder by the Louisville Police Department, who was wrongly executing a no-knock warrant months earlier. Days later, the final match was struck when a video circulated of Minneapolis police officer Derrick E kneeling on George Floyd's back and neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds until he died. The subsequent protests formed what may have been the largest protest movement in American history. Black athletes, no longer preoccupied with practices and games because of COVID, used their profile and platform to support the Black Lives Matter movement. NBA players such as Jaylen Brown and Malcolm Brogdon addressed protests in Atlanta. Tennis star Coco Gauff led a rally in her hometown of Delray Beach, Florida. NASCAR driver Bubba Wallace courageously campaigned for NASCAR to ban the Confederate flag from all events, and he painted Black Lives Matter on his famed number 43 car. College athletes led marches on their campus and in their college towns, challenging racist customs. Student athletes at the University of Texas, for example, wanted building names changed and the school song, The Eyes of Texas, replaced because of its racist undertones. Mississippi State star running back Kalen Hill pushed the state of Mississippi to change the state flag, removing its Confederate iconography. And Black athletes at Kansas State threatened to boycott sports until the university dealt adequately with the racism on its campus. In short, Black athletes and white allies had something to say on racial injustice, often dragging their teams and leagues with them. As noted, college campuses in particular were hotbeds of activism. In addition to the athletic protests at Texas and Mississippi State, Black students led protests and marches in their college towns, drawing attention to the particular racial issues that had long been ignored. No group of athletes did more than those from the Pac-12 conference. Co-ed athletes started We Are United, in a powerful essay that struck at the core of hypocrisy undergirding much of college athletics. The organization declared the following: to ensure future generations of college athletes will be treated fairly, we are united. Because NCAA sports exploit college athletes physically, economically, and academically, and disproportionately harm Black college athletes, we are united. In rejecting the NCAA's claim that Black Lives Matter while systematically exploiting Black athletes nationwide, we are united. The We Are United organization during the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement demanded several things, including health and safety protections during COVID, the protection of all sports from elimination based on budget cuts, the end of racial injustice in college sports and society, and economic freedom and equity. This was perhaps the most powerful statement by college athletes in the summer of 2020. Ultimately, as we all know, college sports returned, but the athletes are fully aware of the power they possess. While this summer was a watershed moment in college athletic protests, The activism should encourage us to examine other historical moments when Black college sports, Black college athletes, push for justice. A considerable amount of historical attention by historians and scholars has focused primarily on the revolt of the Black athlete surrounding the 1968 Olympics and its famed Black Fist in the Air by John Carlos and Tommie Smith. But I want to look at two different moments, one from the 1940s and another from the early 1970s. Now, my book, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, tells the story of HBCU football, or historically Black college football, by examining how Florida A&M University Rattlers under Jake Gaither were able to transform themselves into one of the greatest programs in the 3 decades after World War II. Though through FAMU and Gaither, one can see the development of Black college football through World War II and ultimately the golden age of Black college sports, which happened on the other side of World War II. Now, this history is about institutions, educational, athletic, and media that buttress the game. And this builds on the insight of other scholars who've examined Black institutions that have toiled behind the veil of segregation, like schools, churches, and fraternal organizations, by revealing the importance of HBCU football to African American culture and communities. More than an extracurricular activity, Black college football was the conduit between HBCUs and Black communities. Before professional football became a realistic option, athletic college men and women added the title of coach alongside teacher and preacher as employment options in the early 20th century. In fact, Jake Gaither and other leading athletic mentors acknowledged that a great coach was a combination of a teacher and a preacher. To appreciate Coach Gaither, Florida A&M football, as well as the other Black coaches that plied their trade on the other side of the color line, is also to understand that HBCU football is one of the most critical sources of Black athletic pride, as well as a producer of Black manhood in the 20th century. Beyond simply reviving the vital but too little told stories of HBCUs, my book also puts these stories in their historical context. And crucial to understanding any HBCU football program before World War II is the fact that they were product of what I call sporting congregations, a network of athletes, administrators, coaches, and sports writers and fans. Social historians of African American life have provided a language and theoretical frame to comprehend the broader implications of sporting communities. Notably, historian Errol Lewis has described how African Americans in Norfolk, Virginia, quote, modified the political language so that segregation became congregation, thereby creating a certain degree of autonomy and by extension, power. And although white supremacy circumscribed the extent of this political and potential power, the rise of Black college sports offers remarkable evidence of how much sporting congregations could achieve. While these sporting communities were essential to developing athletics on one side of the color line, they could also be marshaled against racial discrimination more broadly. And so tonight I would like to look at how these congregations challenged racial discrimination, and rather than viewing them as simply a push for integration, I suggest that these were part of athletic calls for justice. The examples I will discuss tonight come from two separate projects. The first comes from my book, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, and points to the ways in which HBCU sports served as an incubator for justice. The second example is from a current research project on race in college basketball. In this case, I broadened my understanding of sporting congregations to look at how a critical mass of Black players can transform college campuses as well as college basketball. And this should force us to rethink our historical interpretations. My second example is very new, and so I appreciate any helpful feedback and comments at the end of this presentation. One of the more interesting intersections that emerged from my work was the connection between Florida A&M's athletic department and The Ohio State University. This relationship was a product of Southern racism, but fueled connections that ultimately challenged Jim Crow through the platform provided by athletics. And this evening, I would like to focus on Big Bill, Bill Bell, or William Big Bill Bell, who was one of the first African-American players to suit up for Ohio State, starting at tackle from 1929 to 1931. He was a star on and off the field in Columbus, and yet, like other Black players at predominantly white institutions, Bell was subjected to what was then known as the Gentleman's Agreement when Ohio State played teams south of the Mason-Dixon line. This agreement was a tacit understanding that the integrated team, in this case Ohio State, would leave or not play their Black players when competing against a Southern team. OSU cowered before Jim Crow twice during Bell's playing career. In 1930, the Buckeyes left Bell at home when they traveled to play Navy in Baltimore. The NAACP's Walter White begged the Ohio State University president to not, quote, not yield to racial prejudice. Yet, Bell stayed at home in Columbus. The very next season, Bell was a star. At season's end, he had earned all Big Ten honors as well as was named an honorable All-American. In the second game of the season, the Buckeyes hosted Vanderbilt University, and questions arose to whether Bell would play. Although he dressed for the game and the game was played in Columbus, he remained on the sidelines for the entire match. And as a result, Vanderbilt ran past Ohio State and surprised the Buckeyes in an upset that afternoon. OSU fans and Black sports writers were cross at the decision. And the school, Ohio State, had a second opportunity when Navy arrived in town later in the 1931 season. By this time of the season, Bell's play, as well as the earlier criticism, changed the outcome. His dominant play led to a victory over the midshipmen and ultimately earned their respect, with many of them shaking his hand and breaking Jim Crow custom at the end of the game. Bell, his classmates, teammates, and supporters made a small dent in the Gentleman's Agreement, an arrangement that lasted until after World War II. Black men, even those as talented, as successful as Bell, that wanted to remain into sports after graduation had few options. Professional football at the time was pushing players such as Joe Lillard and Ray Kemp out of the league in the early 1930s. The only realistic option was working at an HBCU or a Black college. After graduating from Ohio State, Bell was an assistant coach for Howard University before earning his first head coaching job at Claflin College in South Carolina in 1936. During the summer, Bell began work on his master's degree in physical education at OSU, eventually completing it in 1937. In these summer classes, he crossed paths with Alonzo J. Gaither, who was also working on his master's degree as well. Bell was named head coach of Florida A&M in 1936, and he quickly announced his goals as a coach and professor at FAMU. He wanted to, quote, instill a new era in the football destinies of Florida, as well as to develop one of the most well-balanced physical education programs at any Negro college, giving to each sport and to each phase of physical education its proper stimulus and emphasis, end quote. The following season, Bell hired Gaither as his assistant coach. By 1938, the Bell and Gaither duo had won their first college national championship with the Rattlers. As FAMU's program was poised to become a dominant force within the Black college football landscape, the opening salvos of World War II erupted in Europe. The war for European freedoms exposed the contradictions at home for African Americans. The war escalated across the ocean. Germany invaded France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and the Netherlands in early May 1940. The Nazi war machine forced France into an armistice, and it crippled the British in the process. President Roosevelt responded to this Nazi aggression by committing billions of dollars to modernize the American military in preparation for war, and by asking Congress for 50,000 new planes. African Americans were Jim Crowed from wartime industries, but began to protest their second-class citizenships. While the embers of war and the hum of war production seemed a long way from the Black college gridiron, Florida A&M coach Bill Bell refused to stick to sports. In July 1940, he wrote an open letter to President Roosevelt. He used his position as a football coach and a former star player to encourage the president and America to live up to its ideals. This letter was reprinted in dozens of Black newspapers across the country. In the letter, Bell explained that his travels for athletics had taken him across the country, where he discussed the war's far-reaching effects upon our nation, as well as its effects on the Negro. With many of my people in all walks of life, citizens, as you know, who are not able to share in full or enjoy the true democratic privileges of our free and beautiful America. Still, these are citizens that are loyal to American way of life and who dedicate their lives to help preserve all that is American, end quote. He described African Americans, quote, as, quote, loyal to America, having never committed treason, yet they have been forgotten men by the American military and war industry. Bell just wanted African Americans to have an opportunity to earn a living as equal opportunity in the war industry so they could earn a living. He concludes his letter with the following: there is strength and prowess in our 12 million Blacks. There is ingenuity, and most of all, there is loyalty and the will to serve, that we might help uphold this great American cause. We will grant the last drop of our blood to continue democracy and the American way of life. Bell's letter comes 18 months before the official announcement of the Double V campaign by the Pittsburgh Courier, which was based on a letter from a soldier in March of 1943. 1942. In March 1943, after winning his second national title at Florida A&M, Bell volunteered for a Jim Crow army. He stated, quote, most of my boys are in the service or expected to be at any time now, and I wanted to be with them, end quote. As he suggested in his open letter 3 years earlier, Bell saw military service as a vehicle to alter America's standing race relations, a demonstration of African American patriotism. On March 23, 1943, Bell enlisted at Camp Blanding near Stark, Florida, as a private. His decision stood at the intersection of racial uplift, Black manhood, and football, symbolizing the racial sacrifice expected of Black male leadership. As an editorial about Blacks in the war proclaimed, quote, let us pray that the hand of God will shape his destiny so that he can be a man amongst men, not only in the theaters of war, but an equal participant in all the joys, benefits, and results that may come out of war, end quote. The question of social justice in the 1940s often meant donning a uniform in a Jim Crow army. I'm going to switch gears and talk about my new project in here, and it's very much related to my current position at the University of Kentucky. As mentioned earlier, the protests of 2020 affected Kentucky immensely. The murder of Breonna Taylor and the subsequent protests were rooted in the bluegrass state. The police killed Miss Taylor in a no-knock raid in the early mornings of May 26, 2020 in Louisville. 2 days later, protesters were in the street calling for justice. Miss Taylor had attended the University of Kentucky as a student in 2011 before moving to Louisville to become an EMT. UK's president, like many others, condemned the systemic racism exposed in the protests of summer 2020. My colleagues and I in African American and Africana Studies outlined concrete steps to help our university move towards racial equity. These steps included insisting that UK and its contractors maintain the current percentage of Black staff amid COVID. 2, require a course on race and inequality. 3, increase the Black faculty to 15%. This equals the percentage of Black Lexingtonians. 4, increase the number of Black faculty and staff in leadership positions. 5, increase support for Black students financially, mental health, and basic need concerns. 6, develop a system of accountability for racial discrimination. 7, fund the Commonwealth Institute for Black Studies, which is a research center at the University of Kentucky. 8, support a study into the ways that slavery shaped UK's history. 9, reduce the school's cooperation with law enforcement agencies. 10, rename Rupp Arena. Now, as you can imagine, the renaming of the basketball arena garnered the most attention. The press and media, as well as those on social media, this attention grew when Keon Brooks, a starter on the basketball team, in an interview said that he backed changing the name of the arena based on his early research. Now, this attention provides us as scholars, especially as Black Studies scholars, another opportunity to use the lens of Black Studies to examine Black sporting communities. And in this case, we get to understand that the power that the players were able to wield in the 1970s. For those who are unaware, Adolph Rupp was the head basketball coach at the University of Kentucky from 1930 to 1972. At the time of his retirement in 1972, he had the most wins in college basketball history with 876. He led the UK Wildcats to 4 national titles, 27 SEC championships, and was named National Coach of the Year 5 times. The passion for basketball in the state of Kentucky is almost single-handedly due to this legacy. But also part of Rupp's legacy is the fact that he only had 1 scholarship African-American player in 42 years. Rupp signed Tom Paine in 1969, 3 years after Nate Northington and Greg Page signed as the first Black players, scholarship players on the UK football team. So to give you a sense that despite Rupp's legacy, he is behind Charlie Bradshaw, who was the head football coach at the time. Briefly, the defenders of Rupp's racial legacy pointed out to us in African American Studies after we called for the change of the name. The defenders of Rupp's racial legacy point to the fact that he coached a Black player when he was a high school coach in the 1930s, that he was a strong supporter of Don Barksdale as the assistant coach on the 1948 Olympic team, and that he had offered scholarships to a number of Black players, but those players chose not to come to the University of Kentucky. Those players who were offered scholarships included Wes Unseld, Butch Beard, Perry Wallace, who was the first Black player in the SEC who attended Vanderbilt University. They claimed, and their position is that, look, he can't be racist because he has shown these opportunities and others of supporting Black athletes. I want to approach this subject and this topic from a different angle by using the sporting congregation to look at one particular class and in one particular player, a player by the name of Jen McDaniels, who was a high school graduate in 1967 and ultimately chose to attend Western Kentucky University. In 1967, Jim McDaniel was one of the top high school players in the country. Standing at 7 foot, he was a dominant player from Scottsville, Kentucky, a small rural town of a little more than 3,000 people. He was really part of the generation of black students that desegregated America's schools. He spent grades 1 through 8 at a small, underfunded, all-black school. By his freshman year of high school, he was part of this select group of black students that desegregated Allen County High School. By the time he was a senior, though, McDaniels had received more than 100 scholarship offers, none bigger than the one from the University of Kentucky. Reporters followed McDaniels' recruitment closely. At the 1967 Final Four held in Louisville, Kentucky, McDaniels quietly met with Lou Alcindor, now Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who warned him against playing for Rupp. It's not clear what Alcindor knew about Rupp, but like many, he was aware of the reputation. McDaniels visited UK a number of times. He also visited Western as well as a number of other schools. In March of 1967, McDaniels attended the Western Kentucky basketball banquet. The evening's center of attention was forward Clem Haskins, who was awarded first and second team All-American certificates. He was named Player of the Year by the Ohio Valley Conference for the third consecutive season. He was first team All-OVC. He won, and he also got 2 awards from Kentucky Governor Edward Breathitt. Haskins, along with seniors Dwight Smith and Pearl Hicks, gave speeches about their experiences. Haskins and Smith were the first 2 black players at Western Kentucky University. At a corner table were high school recruits taking in the celebration. At the high school table, the center of attention was McDaniels. But he was joined by 4 other African-American star players from the state of Kentucky: Jerome Perry from Louisville, Jim Rose from Hazard, Clarence Glover from Covina, and Jerry Dunn from Glasgow. That evening, watching Haskins and Smith reap the rewards, McDaniels began to wonder what would happen if the talented players sitting next to him all played together. The next day, McDaniels hinted at his plan. He told reporters that he'd like Jim Rose to, quote, go where I go. A package deal was difficult at that time, difficult at the elite levels of recruiting, especially for black players. Yet the African-American players at the banquet table would follow the trail blazed by Haskins and Smith and take the Hilltoppers program to new heights. At the end of the 1967 college basketball season, the sport had been integrated with the exception of a few stubborn programs. No segregated program was bigger than the University of Kentucky. After losing the title game to Texas Western in 1966, the Wildcats stumbled to a 13-13 record the following season. This was the worst in Rupp's career. For those who are aware, saw the movie Glory Road, that depicts the NCAA final against Kentucky versus Texas Western, where Texas Western started 5 black players. It became a Disney movie that many of us have seen. Rupp's Lily White team came under additional scrutiny, especially after the 1967 first team All-American list included 5 African Americans: Lou Alcindor, Clem Haskins, Elvin Hayes at Houston, Wes Unseld from Louisville, and Jimmy Walker of Providence. Rupp's 500 record, combined with Kentuckians Haskins and Unseld's honor, exposed the Baron of the Bluegrass's stubborn and racist recruiting practices. The 1967 class, which included McDaniels, was an opportunity for both Western and UK. After Lou Alcindor had led UCLA to an undefeated season, every coach in the country was looking for the next dominant 7-footer. And McDaniels was right down the road in the state of Kentucky. He was 30 miles from Western's campus and about 100 miles from Lexington. He was also the centerpiece of the most talented class of African Americans basketball players produced to that point in Kentucky's history. 7 of the 10 players named the first team All-State in the state of Kentucky were African American, of course, led by McDaniels. Led by the players, sitting together at the Western Kentucky recruiting table. The recruiting philosophies and efforts of the Hilltoppers and Wildcats coaching staffs highlight differing expectations based on race. John Oldham, the head coach of Western Kentucky, and having already integrated his basketball team, saw an opportunity to achieve unprecedented success on the court. He aggressively sought out the best players in Kentucky, most of whom were African American. On the other hand, the 1967 high school class demonstrated Rupp's reliance on stubborn recruiting practices. The failed attempt to sign McDaniels or any other black player confirmed to many that he did not want an integrated team. Ultimately, Jim McDaniels convinced Clarence Glover, Jerome Perry, and Dunn to join him in Bowling Green. Not Dunn. Rose to join him in Bowling Green. Jerry Dunn and Rex Bailey would join the team after 2 years of junior college. The presence of a critical mass of African American players put Southern sports traditions in the crosshairs. Schools across the South, including Western Kentucky, played the song Dixie as an unofficial fight song, and while fans regularly waved Confederate flags. McDaniels, in their freshman year, and the other black players let it be known that they would not play if the band continued to play Dixie. The band quickly and quietly removed the song from its playlist. Additionally, the Confederate flag was frowned upon, although school officials could not completely stamp out its usage. Finally, the players, led by Jim McDaniels, led marches on campus after Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968. School officials, when they found out about this march, tried to warn them against participating, and McDaniels stared down administrators, saying that this was what they were going to do. Ultimately, the African American basketball players at Western were an active part of attempts to improve the black experience on Western's campus. On the court, Western Kentucky became one of the best teams in the country. In McDaniel's senior season, 1970-71, the Hilltoppers started 5 black players from the state of Kentucky: McDaniels, Glover, Rose, Dunn, and Bailey. In the NCAA tournament, they faced University of Kentucky for the very first time. Western's coach, John Oldham, turned to his assistant coaches seeking suggestions on how to stop the high-scoring Wildcats. Rupp's squad had started the season ranked number 3 and stayed in the top 12 all season. The Cats were the second leading scoring team in the country, averaging 95 points a game. All 5 starters averaged double-digit points per game, led by SEC Co-Player of the Year Tom Parker. While the smooth left-handed Parker garnered the accolades, the nation's attention was on 7'1" Tom Payne, the Wildcats' first African-American player. 5 seasons after they lost to Texas Western, Western's all-black starting 5 in the national title game, an African-American player finally suited up in Wildcat blue. In his first varsity season, Payne scored a hair under 17 points a game and grabbed over 10 rebounds. The Cats finished the season with a 22-5 record. They were SEC champs, and they earned a bye in the then called Mid-East Regional Tournament. Buck Sendor Oldham's longest serving assistant, looked at the challenge and suggested that the Hilltoppers go with a zone defense. Jim Richards, the Hilltoppers' youngest assistant, had a different, more aggressive strategy. He says, quote, "If you let us press them," he told Oldham, "we will beat them badly, maybe by 20 points or more." Oldham sharply chastised his young assistant coach. Quote, "Don't say that. We're talking about Kentucky." Richards shirked back from his assertion, realizing that he had crossed an invisible line. Tensions were already high on the Western Kentucky team. A year earlier, after Western had lost in a tough tournament game to Jacksonville University featuring its star All-American player Artis Gilmore, McDaniel thought that the bracket was stacked in UK's favor. Coach Rupp responded in the press with the following quote. He says, "I don't doubt that the young man said that, but I doubt that he has enough intelligence to comprehend how the NCAA brackets are made. You can quote me as saying that Mr. McDaniels isn't smart enough to know things like that," end quote. As they headed into the game in the following season, McDaniels told reporters, "Bring on Kentucky now." Oldham, in the pregame, in the days leading up to the game, Oldham paced the room, chewing on the defensive conundrums that the Wildcats presented. He turned to Richards and says, quote, "I'm going to put your coaching career on the line. We'll press them and we'll see." The racial composition of the two rosters reflected divergent approaches to integrating college basketball in the South. Western Kentucky had been a leader in the state and the region, signing Clem Haskins in the months before King's "I Have a Dream" speech, while Rupp's Wildcats belatedly signed Tom Paine a year after King's assassination. These two philosophies of race and recruiting finally met on the hardwood in 1971. In the end, UK could not handle the pressure, and the Hilltoppers routed the Wildcats 107-83. McDaniel scored 35 points in the victory. The Hilltoppers would make it to the Final Four, finishing number 3 that season. In this case, Black players from Kentucky, not as individuals, but as a collective, exposed Rupp's obstinate views on the Black athlete. While their work on the court has received tremendous attention, their protest against the playing of Dixie and for the right to honor Dr. King changed Western Kentucky's campus. To briefly follow up on Rupp, Tom Paine, the first Black player signed, left school shortly after the loss to Western to play professional basketball. The following season, the Wildcats lost in the NCAA tournament to Florida State by 19 points, which also started 5 Black players. The leading scorer for the Seminoles that evening was Ron King, former Mr. Basketball from the state of Kentucky. Thank you again for the opportunity to discuss the ways that Black sporting congregations help promote social justice on and off the field. I look forward to hearing your questions and converting this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. White. We do have a couple of questions from the chat. So I think the first question is from Cedric. He says, Dr. White, do you believe that there's some racist undertones that go down in the draft? Oftentimes, Black quarterbacks are subject to racially charged language in the draft. Furthermore, other examples include when they talk about Black athletes' past alleged crimes. Have you noticed this? And just as a side note, Cedric noted that he appreciated the connection between Ohio State and Florida A&M. He's a Bucks fan, but he said that they played each other back in 2012. So that historical connection was interesting.
Yeah, no, yes, thank you for the question, Cedric. A couple things. Let me think a little bit about the draft. Yes, obviously, I think sports is always, I think one of the big takeaways from my work and others that my colleagues who do African-American sports history is that we are very aware of the ways in which race permeates the sports world. I think what makes sports so interesting to us as Americans is that it is is seen as the ultimate type of meritocracy. So we say, hey, this person is clearly the best. Sports measures this out. I mean, part of this is the logic that I am using to really force us to rethink Rupp's recruiting practices, right? Because I'm looking at the logic of wins and losses. That do you get credit for trying to recruit players but being unsuccessful, or should you get credit for actually getting them on your campus and signed and being part of your program, right? And so I think in the case of the NFL draft, yes, that black quarterbacks are often judged under particularly different sets of microscopes and assumptions. Most notably, I had a colleague ask me this question in another talk recently. They get the label of being a dual threat quarterback, right? Even if they can't run, or even if they don't run that much. I think most notably, I saw several years ago, this is a good Ohio State reference, when Dwayne Haskins was coming out, one of the commentators of the draft talked about how he was a dual threat quarterback. And as Ohio State fans know, who saw him play both at Ohio State and his time in Washington, he's not a running quarterback. He is a traditional pocket quarterback. But because of his blackness, they automatically ascribe a certain kind of athleticism towards his positionality. The question about crimes, I suspect that that's probably the case, that when they bring these up, these are often coded language for viewers as well as for owners and decision makers to think about how they rationalize taking or not taking a particular player.
Thank you. The next question is, are there conditions, as you look back historically and we sort of think about today, in which sports are more effective as agents of political change? Is there some reason why it's effective in some time periods or some instances and maybe less effective in others?
Yeah, I think, Howard Bryant makes this claim, the journalist and scholar makes this claim that, we have to remember that athletes and athletics they are the most integrated space in American history, right? That they are the space in which African Americans wholesale get an opportunity to participate. And so the issues of sport are often very effective in showing kind of the ways in which there are certain kinds of limitations on one hand, but more recently, the sports have also have to grapple with this narrative of meritocracy, right? That now that there's no gentleman's agreement keeping, Bill Bell on the bench, or that Major League Baseball is integrated, that the ways in which overt racism, sports is seen as the model for the rest of society, and it also lets sports off the hook in many ways for its inability to address some of the kind of systemic ways that it perpetuates kind of racism in terms of leadership, identity, education, and so forth.
Great, thank you. We have another question from the chat. Elijah wants to know if there was anything that came from the effort to try and change Rupp Arena's name. And I think we could probably broaden this out and to the question of what actually worked at University of Kentucky. And do you have any advice for students at Ohio University or the community at Ohio University for what works when trying to push for these types of changes?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we've got, I think that to be perfectly honest, that the other 9 things on the list have been much stronger than changing the name of Rupp Arena, despite the kind of attention that was paid. I think that I will admit that our university has done a very good job, as good a job as possible, I think, amid COVID, amid Zoom education, tried to keep people from being fired, laid off, furloughed, to make sure that students are getting the kinds of mental health and emotional and even basic needs that they may need. It's been a challenge. I mean, my colleagues in higher education understand that this is a challenge that no school has, I think, successfully done for an A+, but Kentucky hasn't failed either, right? And I think that they have to be acknowledged. I think this question of Rupp Arena is going to be a much more protracted kind of question. I think it is very, in the state of Kentucky and across the nation, Rupp is synonymous with college basketball, and they see this as part of this larger push to erase history. And I always say this quite regularly, that that no one's going to take away Rupp's wins. No one's going to take away the banners that bear his name inside the building. But this is also about how, my argument is always very clear. This is how the university should imagine itself in the future, right? And do we want to honor a man who recruited one single African-American athlete in the time, right? And people will say, well, he was a man of his time. He was a man of his time. So we're saying that this is a man who was unmoved by the entire civil rights movement, right? As I noted in my talk, that, Clem Haskins signs before the March on Washington, and Tom Paine signs a year after King's assassination. For those of us who teach the civil rights movement, that is a lifetime of work, of protests, of activities. Selma, we got a whole, Eyes on the Prize is like 10 hours in between those two moments, right? And I think that that says a lot about the coach, that he's unmoved by any of these kinds of activism. This thing that's happening, that is really one of the defining moments of the 20th century. He's unmoved by any of that, to say, look, I'm going to be, as we say now, on the right side of history. Additionally, and this is not in the talk, but I'll say this, that Rupp is unusual in the sense that that he is really the most powerful coach in college basketball at the time. But he is also being encouraged by the college president as well as the governor of the state to desegregate his basketball team. And so we look at a comparable person like Bear Bryant. Bear Bryant is, whether he wanted to desegregate his team or not, he was going to face obstruction from George Wallace, who was the governor at various times during his tenure, right? So there's a lot of different kinds of cases. Rupp has the support of the hierarchy, the people who supposedly sign his checks. And so him choosing not to do so is not as much about protectionism, but really as obstruction. I see it as obstruction unless someone shows me some different evidence. And so I think there's a question about changing the name is very much important about the future and the way the university imagines itself in the future and the way the athletic department imagines itself in the future. I think that these are really important questions, that these are not questions about the past, but about the present and the future. I think this, of course, is in a similar vein, but not directly related, in the way that Southern campuses across the country are dealing with Confederate monuments and names on their campuses, right? How these schools grapple with these very kind of very difficult questions about how they imagine themselves are being played out all over the country. At North Carolina, they just removed the son of not the son of Sam. What is it? Silent Sam statue at North Carolina. At the University of Texas, they are still grappling with the Eyes of Texas song. There has been some reporting around the firing of Tom Herman was that he supported the student athlete's decision to not come out and sing the song. This and losing twice to my alma mater, Maryland, since this is being live streamed, what led to his firing, right? And so one of the central questions that the new coach was asked is on his first press conferences was how he feels about the Eyes of Texas. And he was like, they will stand for the Eyes of Texas. So it's clear that the boosters and administrations are drawing a hard line about that tradition. I think that the University of Kentucky is going to be, the question about Rupp Arena should be seen in that vein. And much like these other schools who are grappling with these and making kind of small gains here or there, I think this is going to be a long and more protracted struggle.
Thank you. We have a question from Alex who says, Dr. White, I don't see why colleges would sit their star Black athletes during big games. What points were they trying to make with those actions?
Because that's a great question. So the gentleman's agreement, why would you sit your star players if they were African-American and run the risk of losing? That again, in the days before television and televised football, the gate receipts were what drove the games. And so sitting a black player was not going to alter gate receipts. And so what they call intersectional games, games which versus teams against different parts of the country, often drew the most kind of national media attention as well as fans. And so these games versus North and South, well into the 70s, always carried connotations of the Civil War with them. And if you read the newspaper press clippings about any of these games, when Vanderbilt, they invaded the North, right? They invaded Ohio. When the Ohio State decided to not play Bill Bell, they said, the sports writer said that Ohio must be part of the Confederacy, right? This is the way that they describe these games. So these games were really money makers. And so both schools, it benefited both that the gate receipts, which were split under some term under the contract, were extremely valuable. People came out to see if these Southern teams could compete, and vice versa when Ohio State would go. They had already been to Vanderbilt before Bell was on the roster. And so this was the return engagement of a contract between the two schools. And so these are big games quite regularly. We see the remnants of this in our modern kind of college football. This is what the bowl season in many ways is trying to emulate. It's also one of the reasons that Notre Dame plays its fantastic kind of schedule where they play Stanford every year. They play Michigan. They play Navy on a regular basis. These games were very much part of this kind of there's a legacy of the intersectional battles that we saw. And so those games were very, lucrative, and the handful of black players, you're talking about one or two, were not going to stand in the way of those lucrative games.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is kind of coming from both Samantha and Aiden. A similar question. Do you think the NFL is trying to play cleanup with its current support of Black Lives Matter due to their discouragement of protests by Colin Kaepernick? And they know that the commissioner coming out and denouncing police brutality and systemic racism over the summer was definitely a big change from 2016.
Oh, absolutely. Well, here's what I'll say. I think the NFL is in a really complicated position, and the Roger Goodell, regardless of how he personally feels, I think he personally would like to see stronger support for social justice initiatives. I think he's been able to convince the owners. The thing that fans have to remember is that there are 32 owners, and each one of those owners operates as an independent, almost licensee within this league. That Goodell's salary is paid from a percentage of the owners. They all chip in to pay his salary. And so he takes all the criticism for the decisions that he cannot make. And so he cannot make a team hire Colin Kaepernick. He cannot make a team hire a black coach. He cannot make a team interview them beyond what is set out by the Rooney Rule. He cannot make any of these things happen. He knows that whoever the individual owners are doing so. So I think it's a question of really thinking about how would we understand these 32 owners, right? What are they? How do they understand themselves? What are their broader politics? What would they like to do? And given that these are billion-dollar franchises, that we understand that this is the elite of the elite. And in other industries, we see similar kinds of struggles among elites of dealing with Black Lives Matter, racial equity, diversity, all these kinds of issues that plague the NFL also plague Silicon Valley, right? And so this is nothing new. I think that the NFL as an entity presents a shield, but in reality, it's a shield made up of 32 puzzle pieces that operate kind of very independently of one another for the name of the league. And so it does. I think that they are doing some cleanup. They would like to say that they're doing this summer. As I said, the summer of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor exposes all these leagues, but their ability to rectify any of these things is much more difficult than the Roger Goodell could possibly do as the commissioner.
A quick follow-up, sort of kind of related, different sport, but what do you or what should we make of reports that President Obama suggested, or the reports are that President Obama suggested that LeBron James and the other athletes stop sort of their walkout, their NBA walkout over the summer? How should we interpret that?
We should interpret that the WNBA's politics are far more advanced and they're organized, are far more advanced than the NFL. I mean, the NBA's politics. And I think it speaks to just the broader kind of way that the WNBA moves as a league and moved. I think that when we write this history, I'm co-editing a special issue of the Journal of African American History that's going to come out this summer. And one of the things that we open with is a discussion of the WNBA, right? That the vote Warnock and getting Raphael Warnock from that open runoff where he was polling at under 10% to massive name recognition to pull off this runoff victory in January is an amazing political story. It is a story that when we tell the story of athletic activism, that the WNBA will go on this pantheon of alongside of Muhammad Ali and the revolt of the black athlete, what they pulled off this summer. I think that the LeBron's and the NBA's sensibilities of appealing to Obama makes sense for where they are economically, that it speaks to the kind of differing marginalization within the broader scheme of America. And so they see, LeBron sees himself closer to Obama, but the WNBA, in fighting one of their own owners and Kelly Loeffler, took a much more savvy political strategy that was far more transformative both than either the walkout and or them coming back to play.
Thank you. Okay, our next question is from Kamal. Hi, Dr. White. As a current student athlete here at Ohio University, what do you think fellow athletes like myself can do to help lead change on campus and fight systemic racism?
That's a great question. I think that I think there's two things. One, I think that there has to be a commitment to study. One of the challenges, and I'm gonna, as a former student athlete myself, I played soccer at the University of Maryland. I'm very clear on the kind of time constraints put on college athletes from the tennis team all the way up to the football team, whether it's travel, practice, study, etc. So part of it is taking control of your own education, right? To making sure that you're in the kinds of classes, in the kind of major that you want to be in. I know that this may or may not be the case at Ohio University, but at many institutions that student athletes are funneled into majors that are going to keep them eligible, but not advance their way of understanding the world. And so I think that's the first piece. The second piece is also get out of the athletic bubble, talking to the other organizations on your campus, whether it is, I'm gonna pull up the title of this organization, the Black Student Organization Coalition, look at that, the NAACP, or the fraternities and sororities on your campus who are politically active. Like, getting involved in those spaces forces you to get out of the bubble. One of the things that modern college sports in general do, probably better than anything else, is make college athletes of whatever sport they play extremely isolated. You live with your teammates, you practice with them, you eat with them, you party with them, you travel with them, and that's your that's your bubble for the entire 4 years. You take the same classes together, and so really pushing yourself to be outside. That leadership requires service, right? And I always say this. I say this to many of my student athletes, and I say that if you want to lead, you have to serve. That you can't be in the front of the line until you've served the back of the line. And I think that part of what being an athlete, that is a kind of humbling and humility needed in order to demonstrate that you are concerned about these issues that are may not be affecting you in the same way as they're affecting your classmates. The third piece is identifying something very specific that you want to target and try to improve. So the problem with systemic racism and racism in general is that it is literally everywhere. And so how does it can be overwhelming. So targeting your energies to feel like, look, this is something that we as a community or we as an athletic community can target and try to rectify in a particular way. That is something that you can do, that you can organize with your classmates and move on. I hope those 3 things help.
Thank you. All right, we have a question/comment from Zach in the chat. Not a question per se, but I would just like to hear your opinion on some of the young athletes thinking about going to HBCUs, like Mikey Williams, McCurry Maker. Also, Robert Covington started for the Portland Trailblazers, is having a lot of success in the league after coming out of Tennessee State and HBCU.
Yeah, I think this is I think there's been a larger conversation, to be perfectly blunt, that the kind of racism that students face and student athletes face on predominantly white campuses have led Black students of all ilk to really reconsider the kinds of educational, social, and cultural experiences that you receive at historically Black colleges. One of the things that I think is important at those institutions is that being a racial minority in America, but on these college campuses, can be exhausting. And at an HBCU, that for a little window, you don't have to be exhausted about these particular issues on campus, at least, right? You're still living in the United States, you're still living in a state, in America, in the globe, but that doesn't have to be exhausting. And I think that student athletes, both historically and contemporarily, are considering these as viable options. But the other piece is that Black colleges have always produced, even after integration, have always consistently produced a steady stream of professional athletes who have been highly successful, and so that will always continue. And I think that what we're seeing now is just a fluctuation. When I went to school, I'm going to tell my age here, but when I went to college in the 90s, there was a huge fluctuation in college in attention and attending HBCUs, in part because a different world was on television, in part because people were really grappling with the implications of the Rodney King verdict and what that meant. For those who are a little bit younger than me, my brother, they grew up they watched the OJ trial and saw that this, and so the Black colleges provide a particular kind of space and opportunity, and they are many of them are resource challenged, but they make up for it, right, with human resources. I talk a lot about this in my book, even on the athletic side, that they lacked material resources, but they more than made up for it with human resources.
Thank you. In the push to rename Rupp Arena, were alternative names put forth as options, or was it just the push to just simply change to something else?
We pushed to change to something else. I think that, as I told my colleagues, we live in a modern sports world where our football stadium, Commonwealth Stadium, is now Kroger Field, right? Like, we are selling these naming rights to these stadiums. And so, ironically, as we deal with these budget crunch because of COVID, there's actually a possibility, probably a stronger possibility than less, that if there is an opportunity to change, now is the time to do it, because Rupp Arena, for those who are unaware, is the largest kind of on-campus basketball arena in America. That's not a dome, single use, whereas I think the Carrier Dome is the largest, but it's a dual purpose facility. It holds 25,000. This is bigger than most of your NBA arenas. It is bigger than the vast majority of college arenas in the country. And so it is a valuable piece of property in the college athletic landscape. And so if they ever decide to change it, they may not do it because of what our claims are. They may do it because someone makes them an offer that they cannot resist to use to put their naming rights on. To support a dramatically growing athletic budget.
That's really interesting. I can totally see that happening, that being a sort of option that some people would look for in this moment. And it's kind of related to this next question is, in this current moment of austerity and budget cutbacks, oftentimes you see academics pitted against athletics. I think your talk has given us a valuable reason why we should be wary of that type of narrative. But I'm wondering, when you encounter that type of discussion on campus, what do you say, or how do you push back against that?
That's a tough one, because I'm employed on one side of that argument, right? Like my self-interest is very much tied to the academic side. I will say this, like one of the things that was most impressive about the ways in which the Florida A&M athletic department worked from its beginning through the 1970s is that when you look at Bill Bell or Jake Gaither, they served as the athletic director. They had master's degrees. They taught physical ed. Like Gaither was the chair of the physical education department, right, on campus, in addition to coaching football, in addition to being the athletic director, right? The assistant coaches had master's degrees and taught classes in the physical education department, right? So they were never solely in the silo of being athletic coaches. They were very much part of an athletic culture of the institution, but they taught in a department like what we would think of now as kinesiology or something of that nature. I think that one of the things that pits this problem is that there are finite resources, right? That we are not operating under the belief that there are just an infinite number of dollars that are going to matriculate to any particular campus. And the reason that there's so much money to athletics and not to the academic side is in part because they don't pay players, to be honest, right? Like, so you always have to raise more money, and you always, any additional dollars gets funneled back into facilities across the nation. And so, anytime you look on the internet or social media, you'll see schools talking about their fancy new locker room and all these new things that are better than NFL locker rooms, in part because you don't have to, you have to spend this money. And if you're raising this money, you also do this. The other problem is that this academics versus athletics is complicated by the fact that athletics has a set of boosters who are unaccountable to a large number of the university infrastructure. And so it is boosters who can single-handedly, fire a coach, right? There were reports when Gus Malzahn got fired at Auburn this year, to give you a contemporary example, that he had a buyout of $24 million in which one person paid because he was tired of Gus Malzahn and losing, so what could the rest of Auburn's academic enterprise do, right? And so this is not, it's true we have to be very careful here because, just because he gave $24 million to athletics does not mean that he was going to give $24 million to the library, right? But I do think that there is a sense that athletics is garnering a tremendous amount of development dollars on institutions that are not inherently elitist and wealthy. Harvard doesn't have that problem, right? They have the other problem where they're spending more money on academics than they are probably on athletics. But at, Ohio or Ohio State or Kentucky, it's easy to raise, we'll raise $100 million this year because we need, a new practice facility. These are the kinds of comments, whereas the library may be falling apart. There was a great story when LSU announced its new locker room that its library was in disrepair, mold and things of this nature. And it raises questions about, not the academic versus the athletic, but regular curricular versus extracurricular, right? And the highest paid coaches don't teach regular students. And the least paid adjunct professors are often teaching, student athletes. And so there's an asymmetrical kind of relationship between the two.
That makes a lot of sense. And as a University of Georgia fan, I too was tired of Gus Malzahn, but I'm not sure I would have paid $24 million to see him go. But our next question is sort of related to something that you touched on is what are your thoughts on payments to student athletes and how that affect HBCU schools and athletics?
I mean, it's a twofold question. One, I think student athletes need to get paid. I think that there's an infrastructure that this world, the budgets, especially at the elite level, are so out of control that it's hard to have this conversation with a straight face. You know, the University of Texas or Ohio State's athletic budget is greater than $200 million a year. And so for us in academia, you know, the College of Arts and Sciences at University of Kentucky is probably the largest college in the UK, and it's $80 million a year budget or something of that nature, right? So these athletic budgets are enormous, right? And they're enormous for lots of reasons, but part of it is that we're paying coaches. A lot of it's paid in both facilities and in coaches. For HBCUs, any push to pay players from the university set of accounts will create discrepancies, but these discrepancies are already there. So it's not as if, like, you know, I think part of the discussion with that question is often hidden, like, well, there won't be a level playing field, as if there's a level playing field now, right? Like, Ohio State's not, like, to be perfectly honest, Ohio State's not losing a lot of recruits to Kentucky or Ohio, right? Like, this is the way the game is already operating. And so paying the players would not necessarily dramatically change or transform that. The name, image, and likeness legislation, which is currently a model in which student athletes become independent brands, which they can set out and, you know, make their own kind of individual deals, and so long as they don't necessarily interfere with the Nike deal that the university has per se. Black colleges may have a potential to really gain into that because of the ways in which Black culture really shapes popular culture, right? And so Black colleges are often on the cutting edge of the kind of the newest, latest edge of culture. And so you could go to an HBCU and you could be on the front end of that, and that could really bear out for you. And so there's some possibilities in these places, but any of these colleges that are small and rural, like many Black colleges are going to struggle with the possibility of paying. But that, you know, that struggle should not preclude us figuring out a way to have a more equitable system for the student athletes.
Oh, thank you. I don't see any other questions in the chat, and so if people do have anything to add, please do. Is there anything that sort of we've missed or that you were expecting to get asked that didn't get asked?
No, not really. I think we touched on a lot of important things. I'll say that, you know, the question about the coaching that I brought up before, I think is a very fraught and important question. I think one of the things that emerges from my work is to look at kind of player empowerment at the elite level, to look at what I talked about today, the ways that Jim McDaniels encouraged his teammates. There's a story that I didn't talk about today about how they were all at an all-star game, and he forced them to put their hand in the pile, and like, we're all going to Western, right? Like, this is, and one of the players had already verbally committed to another program, and he's looking at him like, "No, I'm not going." And so he stood in the doorway until the young man put his hand in the pile and committed to Western, right? But one of the things that you can see in that kind of player empowerment moment, the way that Lou Alcindor is saying, "Hey, look, I don't care where you go, young man, but you should really reconsider this," is that, you know, how can elite players really shape the coaching profession in real ways, right? And saying that, you know, that I want to play for a Black coach. And these are the opportunities that can be provided by playing for a Mike Locksley at Maryland or a Mel Tucker versus a Nick Saban, right? That these are real kinds of discussions, and these are very political discussions, right? Because as we saw this summer, many of these coaches, especially the white coaches, really fumbled their way through how to deal with this Black Lives Matter, right? And so if you're a parent of one of these athletes, you want your son or daughter to make it to the elite level, but you also want to see them personally grow and develop. And these coaches will come into your living room and tell you how much they care about them and do all these things. But when you look at that evidence, and so players have a lot of power, right? And they can really reshape, the next coach, right? If players are taking their talents to play for Mike Loxley or Shaka Smart or someone of that nature, then when an opening comes up, you're looking at the way players are making decisions, and this can affect the way you make a hire as your next head coach. And I think some of that is there. We see this at the University of Kentucky, right? That losing to Western and losing to Florida State forces the University of Kentucky. I can't wait till COVID's over. I can get in the archives and really kind of tease this out. But he is forced into mandatory retirement at 72. In 1972, he's got to be they're saying you got to be retired because you've reached this mandatory retirement age. I think it's 70 or 72 or something like that. And what's interesting is he's Adolph Rupp. If he had done everything right, I'm sure they would have waived it for him, but they didn't, in part because I think the blowout loss to Western and then the loss to Florida State with these Kentucky players that were on the roster was, I think there's a lot, I think that there's some reporting on this at the time, but I think that one of the things I'm looking for in this next project to really look in the archives is try to see in the presidential papers or the AD papers or whatnot to figure out, was this nudge? This was definitely a nudge towards retirement. And his replacement, I want to say this very quickly, his replacement was Joe B. Hall, who was his lead assistant on those teams. And Joe B. Hall was the assistant that was tasked with recruiting many of these black players. And so he's the one who, in his first class, signs Reggie Warford. And several years later, in 1974, he signs Lexington's Jack Givens and James Lee, two African-American players who were from Lexington, Kentucky. And Joe B. Hall will win a national title in 1978 with those two guys as players. Jack Givens was an All-American and most valuable player of the 1978 tournament. So you can draw a straight line between these losses, the retirement, and the decision to promote Joe B. Hall into that space. And I think that part of the way that Black Studies comes in, I think as we both work in Black Studies, is that part of our job is to challenge these narratives, these meta narratives that are often kind of unexamined assumptions about how we imagine ourselves. We do this at the national level in Black Studies, but there's nothing saying that we shouldn't do this in sports as well. And I think that this is a perfect example of that. So I think that the player empowerment piece for coaches and coaching, I think, is a very valuable lens that I'm personally keeping my eye on moving forward.
Yeah, I think there was this isn't college, but I believe Urban Meyer just had an incident with had taken over the Jaguars, and the coaching staff he decided to hire kind of around a similar issue, demonstrating some of the power and potential of this moment, I think. But, well, Dr. White, I want to thank you so much for being here and being our inaugural speaker for the Ted Rose Lecture Series. I really enjoyed it. I see people in the chat really enjoyed it. So thank you so much.